For 35 minutes, nobody on either side fired a shot. An American battleship had a Japanese fleet locked on radar, tracking its course and speed in total silence. In water so dark, the crew couldn't see their own bow. On the other side, Vice Admiral Nishimura Shoji kept his ships moving forward at 20 knots, straight into a channel with only one way out, because those were his orders. Then at 3:51 a.m., the silence broke. In the 18 minutes that followed, the Imperial Japanese Navy's last battle line, 2 battleships, a cruiser, and a handful of destroyers, was almost completely destroyed by an enemy most of them never saw. This is the story of how that 18 minutes was built, hours before the first shell ever landed, and why the men who fired it were standing on ships Japan had already sunk once before. For 35 minutes, nobody on either side fired a shot. That silence is where this story actually begins. But to understand why it happened, you have to go back 3 days to a plan so complicated that the men ordered to carry it out privately doubted it could work. By October of 1944, Japan was losing a war it had already, quietly, admitted it could not win. American forces had landed on the island of Leyte in the central Philippines. If the Philippines fell, the sea lanes carrying oil from the south to the Japanese home islands would be cut. Without that oil, the war machine simply stopped. There would be no need for the Americans to invade Japan itself. It would starve on its own soil. So the Japanese Navy did something it had never done before. It committed almost everything it had left, nearly every capital ship still afloat, to a single operation meant to break that landing before it could take hold. The plan was called Shogo, and it was built on a gamble so severe that one senior admiral, hearing the plan explained to him, asked a single question. Was there any purpose in preserving the fleet if the cost was losing the Philippines? Nobody in that room needed to answer. Everyone already knew. Shogo split the Japanese fleet into 3 separate forces, converging on Leyte Gulf from 3 different directions, on a schedule so precise it required almost nothing to go wrong. A decoy force of aircraft carriers, almost entirely empty of aircraft, would sail down from the north and try to pull the powerful American carrier fleet away from the invasion beaches. A second force, the strongest of the 3, would come through the San Bernardino Strait, also from the north. And a third force, the weakest, the oldest, the least likely to survive the night, would push up from the south through a narrow channel called the Surigao Strait, so that Japan's remaining warships could crush the invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf between 2 jaws. Command of that southern force went to Vice Admiral Nishimura Shoji. He was 56 years old, a career officer, not a headline name, the kind of admiral whose service record fills a page without ever once appearing in a newspaper. What we know of him is drawn mostly from what he did, because he left almost nothing behind, explaining why. His force was small and it was old. 2 battleships, the Fuso and the Yamashiro, both laid down during the First World War, decades before this war had even started. They had been rebuilt in the 1930s, given the towering pagoda masts that made Japanese capital ships instantly recognizable, stacked platforms and rangefinders, rising like a tower over the sea. Each carried 12 14-inch guns. On paper, that was serious firepower. In practice, they were slow, their armor built for a different era of naval combat, and their crews were not the elite of the Japanese Navy. Both ships had spent most of the war sitting in home waters, used for training, held in reserve, considered too slow, too vulnerable for the fast carrier battles that had defined the Pacific War until now. This operation, at the very end, was the first real combat either of them had seen. Alongside the two battleships, Nishimura had the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers. 7 ships, sent to force a defended strait at night with no air cover because Japan's naval aviation had already been destroyed months earlier over the Philippine Sea and never rebuilt. Nishimura knew all of this. He was not walking into this blind. He had been attacked from the air the previous day and had already taken damage. He knew the Americans had found him. He knew there would be no surprise left by the time he reached that strait, and he took his ships forward anyway, at the exact hour he had been ordered to. That single fact, the timing, the obedience to a schedule down to the hour, is where the first real fracture in the Japanese plan begins to show, because Nishimura was not the only Japanese force heading for that strait that night. Roughly 40 miles behind him, closing on the same narrow channel, was a second Japanese squadron, 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and several destroyers under Vice Admiral Shima Kiyohide. Here is the detail that should stop you. Shima did not report to Nishimura. Nishimura did not report to Shima. They belonged to entirely separate commands. They had made no joint plan. They had exchanged almost no communication at all. 2 Japanese naval forces converging on the exact same channel, on the exact same night, with no coordination whatsoever. This was not an accident. It was not a breakdown in radio equipment or bad luck in the weather. It was structural. For years, Japanese naval doctrine had leaned on dividing forces into separate detachments approaching from separate directions, on the theory that complexity would confuse the enemy. On a planning chart, in daylight, in a briefing room, that kind of plan can look elegant. At sea, at night, under radio silence, with ships already taking battle damage, it requires a level of coordination that simply does not survive contact with reality. Shima was senior to Nishimura in years of service, but he was not senior in the chain of command that mattered that night, and neither man had the authority to give the other orders. Rather than resolve it, the High Command left the 2 squadrons to sort it out between themselves. They did not sort it out. Shima made his own decision. He would hang back roughly 40 miles behind Nishimura and follow him in, which meant that instead of 2 Japanese forces striking together in the same hour, overwhelming whatever defense waited for them, the Americans would get the chance to destroy one force completely, and then watch the second arrive too late to do anything but witness the wreckage. Nishimura went forward alone, and waiting for him at the northern end of that strait was a kind of advantage the Japanese Navy did not yet fully understand it had already lost. For 20 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained for night combat like no other fleet on Earth. In the early battles around Guadalcanal, 2 years before this night, Japanese cruisers and destroyers had repeatedly torn apart American forces in close, brutal, nighttime surface actions, using superior optics, relentless drilling, and a torpedo that ran farther and hit harder than anything the Americans possessed. In 1942, meeting the Japanese Navy at night had been close to a death sentence. Officers on those 2 aging battleships and on the destroyers screening them had spent years training for exactly this kind of fight. Confused, close range, decided by nerve and skill in total darkness. But 2 years is a long time in this war, and while the Japanese Navy kept drilling for the battle it knew how to win, something had changed quietly in laboratories and shipyards, far from any battlefield. Radar, not a rumor, not a theory. By 9,944, American naval radar could track an enemy ship in complete darkness at a range of over 20 miles and calculate a firing's solution before that enemy ever came close enough to fire back. Superb night vision, the finest optics in the world, years of drilling in the dark, all of it is worth almost nothing against an enemy who can see you clearly from 24 miles away in a night with no moon and put a shell on your deck from 13. The skill an entire generation of Japanese officers had built their careers on had just been made obsolete, quietly, without a single training exercise to reveal it. And the men steaming toward that strait were about to discover exactly how obsolete, in the worst possible way, in the dark, with nowhere to turn around. That difference was larger than a new instrument bolted to a mast. It changed the geometry of night combat. Before radar, darkness protected both sides. It shortened engagement ranges, rewarded the first ship to spot a silhouette, and turned every flash of gunfire into information. A commander could hide in the black, maneuver unseen, and hope to close until optics, training, and nerve decided the fight. Radar broke that bargain. Now darkness protected only the side that could see through it. The Americans did not need a lookout to identify a mast against the horizon. They did not need a searchlight that would reveal their own position the instant it switched on. They could build a plot from electronic returns and hand the gunnery crews a range and bearing, while the enemy still believed the night itself was concealment. That is why Surigao was more than an ambush. It was a collision between two eras of naval warfare occupying the same water at the same time. Nishimura's officers had trained to master darkness. Oldendorf's ships had learned how to remove darkness from the equation. One side entered expecting a night battle. The other was preparing a firing problem against a target that could not see them back. Nishimura had one more piece of information most commanders would have found paralyzing. He knew he had already lost the one advantage that might have saved his mission surprise. He knew there was no air cover coming. He knew the ships behind him were not going to arrive in time to help. He signaled his intentions north anyway. He formed his ships into line, and at the hour written into a plan, drafted days earlier, in a room hundreds of miles from that strait, Vice Admiral Nishimura Shoji took his column forward, into water he could not see across, toward an enemy who already knew exactly where he was. The clock had already started. He simply didn't know how little of it was left. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf did not look like a man about to win the last battleship duel in history. He was 60 years old. He had spent most of this war doing the unglamorous work escorting convoys, bombarding beaches, the kind of assignments that never make it into a headline. He did not give quotable interviews. He was not the kind of officer men wrote home about. What he was, by the unanimous agreement of everyone who served under him, was thorough, almost frighteningly thorough. He had roughly 36 hours of warning that a Japanese force was coming for the strait his ships were guarding. 36 hours, that was all the time history gave him to design a plan that would still be studied in naval academies 80 years later. and the first thing he understood was the ground itself. The Surigao Strait is a long, narrow channel running between islands in the central Philippines. A force entering from the south has almost no room to maneuver, almost no room to turn a battle line around. Only one way in, only one way out. It is, in the plainest possible terms, a funnel. Oldendorf looked at that funnel and saw something most commanders would have missed under the pressure of 36 hours. He saw a killing ground already built by geography. All he had to do was fill it correctly. So he built his defense in layers, one behind another, designed so that anything entering that strait would have to pass through every single one before it ever saw open water again. But before we walk through those layers, there is something you need to understand about the ships waiting at the far end of them. Because on paper, Oldendorf commanded an overwhelming force. 6 battleships, a wall of cruisers. In practice, his advantage was thinner than it looked, and he knew it better than anyone. His ships had spent the previous days doing exactly what they were built for. In this campaign, pounding the invasion beaches in support of the landings on Leyte, which meant their magazines were heavy with high explosive shells built for tearing apart shore defenses and troop positions. What they were short on was armor-piercing ammunition, the kind of shell you need to punch through the hull of another battleship. Some of his ships had only a fraction of the armor-piercing rounds they would want for a fleet engagement against enemy capital ships. Oldendorf understood exactly what that meant. He could not afford a long, grinding gunnery duel. If this fight dragged on, if the Japanese ships closed the range and turned it into an extended exchange, his own ammunition situation could become a serious problem. His plan had to be quick. It had to be overwhelming from the very first minute of contact. And it had to make sure the fight never had the chance to become a fair one. So he gave orders that fire, when it came, would be deliberate, controlled, and devastating, not prolonged. He was building a machine designed to attend things in minutes because he knew he could not sustain a fight measured in hours. The first layer of that machine was the smallest and the strangest. 39 motor torpedo boats, small, fast, built almost entirely of plywood, powered by aircraft engines that gave them astonishing speed and offered their crews no protection whatsoever. Oldendorf spread them in sections across roughly 50 miles of water, down the length of the strait and out into its southern approaches. Their job was not, primarily, to sink anything. Their job was to find the enemy in total darkness, report his exact position, his course, his speed, and then harass him however they could as he came north. They were the eyes of the trap, and the men who crewed them had one of the strangest and most exposed jobs in the entire United States Navy. Attacking a battleship in an 80-foot plywood boat is roughly the same as attacking a tank on a motorcycle. And that night, they did it again and again, running in under searchlights and heavy gunfire, launching torpedoes, absorbing fire from an entire Japanese column at once, then falling back into the darkness to report what they had seen. Every section had 2 standing orders. Attack if you can. Report no matter what happens. The boat captains understood, without anyone needing to explain it twice, which order actually mattered. They were being used as a tripwire, strung across an ocean, and their true weapon that night was not a torpedo, it was a radio. The second layer was the one almost nobody expected to matter as much as it did. Destroyers. Oldendorf positioned squadrons of them along both sides of the strait, tucked in close against the shore lines, where the darkness would hide them from Japanese lookouts. As Nishimura's column came up the center of the channel, those destroyers would dash out from the flanks, fire full salvos of torpedoes at close range, and turn away behind smoke before the enemy's guns could ever find them. Each destroyer carried 10 torpedoes, attacking from both sides at once, from angles the Japanese could not anticipate. They represented an enormous, concentrated weight of firepower delivered by ships a fraction the size of a battleship. This doctrine had been rebuilt from a hard lesson. 2 years earlier, in the night battles around Guadalcanal, American destroyers had often been held back defensively, and Japanese squadrons attacking aggressively with torpedoes had cost them dearly for that caution. American officers had studied those defeats carefully for years, until the destroyer torpedo attack became something rehearsed and precise. Close, fast, fire. Withdraw immediately behind smoke without lingering to admire the results. Each wave would strike a column already reacting to the wave before it. The destroyer crews also understood something that is easy to miss when the battle is reduced to arrows on a map. Their attack demanded that they deliberately leave the protection of the battle line, accelerate towards ships many times their size, expose themselves long enough to fire, and then turn away before the enemy could answer effectively. There was no room for hesitation. A torpedo attack works because geometry works. The launch point matters. The angle matters. The enemy's speed matters. Too early, and the weapons run through empty water. Too late, and the destroyer is close enough for a battleship's guns to tear it apart. So the American captains were not simply charging. They were executing a timed problem in darkness, under fire, against a column whose shape was changing as ships reacted to attacks ahead of them. That made the layered defense even more dangerous. Turn away from torpedoes coming from one flank, and a ship could expose itself to the next attack from the other. Slow down to regain formation, and the column compressed. Speed up, and damaged vessels dropped out. The trap did not require Nishimura to make a foolish decision. It only required him to react like any commander would react when torpedoes were already in the water. It was designed to arrive not as a single blow, but as a series of shocks, one after another, before the enemy could recover from the first. And the third layer, waiting at the very top of the funnel, was the battle line itself. 6 battleships, a heavy screen of cruisers, American and Australian, drawn up across the channel at a right angle to it. Naval officers have a name for this formation, crossing the T. It is the oldest dream in the history of naval gunnery. The enemy comes up the stem of that T in a column, able to fire only his forward guns. The defender sits across the top of it, able to fire every gun on every ship at once. The advantage in that formation is not marginal. It is total. Oldendorf had built exactly that, a detection screen to find the enemy, a torpedo force positioned to wound him from angles he could not cover, and behind all of it, a wall of naval guns, arranged in the one formation that guarantees maximum firepower in exchange for almost no return fire at all. There was no flourish anywhere in this plan, no gamble. It is the work of a man who intended to leave absolutely nothing to chance, which is, in the end, the correct way to fight a battle when the advantage has already been handed to you. Late on the evening of October 24th, Nishimura's force entered the southern approaches to the strait, and at around 10 o'clock that night, the patrol boats found him. From that moment forward, the Japanese force was never out of American sight for long. Boat after boat came racing in through the dark to attack, was driven off by searchlights and gunfire, and fell back to report exactly what it had seen. Radio messages flowed north, hour after hour, building a continuous picture of the enemy's position, his course, his speed, feeding it directly to Oldendorf as the trap ahead of him waited unseen. In material terms, those attacks accomplished almost nothing. Across the entire night, the patrol boats launched dozens of torpedoes at Nishimura's column. Not one of them found its target. One American boat was lost in the exchange, but what those boats delivered was worth far more than a single hit. They gave Oldendorf a running commentary on his enemy's approach, and they gave Nishimura hours of harassment that told him nothing useful at all, nothing he could act on, nothing that changed his course, his speed, or his orders. Just hours of tension, hours of searchlights sweeping black water, hours of guns manned and ready, firing at shapes in the dark that were never quite where the gunners aimed. A crew that has spent an entire night at action stations, repeatedly attacked, repeatedly firing at shadows, is a tired crew. By the time the real fighting began, the men on Nishimura's ships had been keyed up for hours already, exhausted, on edge, and they had lost the one thing that might have saved them. Surprise. From 10 o'clock that night onward, the Americans knew exactly where Nishimura was, how fast he was moving, and roughly when he would arrive. They had time to make their final adjustments to a plan that was already complete. Nishimura pressed on anyway. At around 2:11 in the morning, he formed his ships into battle order for the run up the channel. He signaled his intentions north to the other Japanese commanders, reporting that he was engaging enemy torpedo boats and that his advance continued as planned. Then he took his column up the middle of the strait at 20 knots, directly between two lines of American destroyers waiting in the dark along both shores. The second layer of the trap was about to close. The destroyer attack began just before 3 o'clock in the morning, and it remains one of the most devastating single actions in the history of surface warfare. Squadrons came in from both sides of the channel at once, closing to within roughly 4 miles, firing full salvos of torpedoes into the Japanese column and turning away hard behind smoke. Japanese searchlights swept the black water. Japanese guns opened fire in return, but the American ships were already gone, zigzagging away into darkness before the muzzle flashes had even faded. A few minutes later, the torpedoes arrived. The destroyer Yamagumo was struck and exploded with such violence that the flash was seen from the American battle line miles away, her own torpedoes almost certainly detonating in the blast. The destroyer Michishio was crippled. The destroyer Asagamo had her bow torn away, and the battleship Fuso in the Japanese line was struck on her starboard side and fell out of formation, burning. She did not survive the night. Fuso drifted out of the column on fire and went down before dawn. For decades, the standard version of this story claimed she broke apart into 2 burning halves, drifting separately across the water. That image has been repeated in book after book, documentary after documentary. Modern research on the wreck itself and on surviving Japanese records casts real doubt on it. The better supported account is simpler and in its own way more brutal. She was torpedoed, she caught fire, and she sank. What is certain, what deserves to be said plainly, because most tellings of this story lose it entirely, is this. A battleship of the Imperial Japanese Navy was destroyed by torpedoes fired from destroyers in the dark before the American battle line had fired a single shot from its main guns. The Southern force was broken by small ships in darkness before the great guns ever entered the story at all. By the time Nishimura came within range of Oldendorf's battle line, he had already lost one battleship, one destroyer, sunk outright, two more destroyers, crippled and falling behind. He was down to his flagship, one heavy cruiser, and a single intact destroyer. The Yamashiro herself had already taken at least one torpedo. She was flooding, she was slowed, and Nishimura had a clear picture of exactly what was happening to the force he commanded. He sent a signal north, reporting the torpedo damage. He stated that his battle integrity was not impaired. Then he ordered his surviving ships to continue forward, across the northern exit of the strait. The American battle line had been tracking this approach for some time, without seeing a single thing. The night was pitch black. No moon worth mentioning, no starlight to speak of. The Japanese ships were still far beyond the range of any human eye. What the Americans had instead was radar, and by 1944, the best of it was very good. At 16 minutes past 3 in the morning, the battleship West Virginia's fire control radar picked up the approaching column at a range of 42,000 yards, roughly 24 miles. She began tracking. For the next 35 minutes, the American line held its fire completely, simply watched the plot, calculated course and speed, refined the firing solution again and again, waiting for the range to close to something that guaranteed a hit. Picture it plainly, because it is a strange thing to hold in your mind. A battleship in total darkness, silent, following an enemy she cannot see with her own eyes, as he walks steadily forward into her guns. Those 35 minutes were not empty time. They were the battle line converting information into certainty. Every minute, the range closed, the solution improved. Course, speed, bearing, distance. The Japanese column was doing the same thing it had been doing for hours moving north, and that consistency made the plot cleaner with every sweep. The Americans were not waiting because they had lost nerve. They were waiting because there was no reason to reveal themselves early. A less disciplined force might have opened fire as soon as the target appeared at the edge of effective range. The first salvos might have missed. The flashes would have announced the battle line's position. Nishimura might have turned sooner, scattered his remaining ships, or at least understood the scale of the force blocking the strait. Oldendorf's line gave away nothing. The Japanese ships kept coming toward a firing solution that became less approximate and more final with every mile. By the time West Virginia opened fire, the Americans had spent more than half an hour doing the one thing the Japanese could not do, in return studying an enemy that did not know he was being studied. That silence was not the absence of action. It was preparation in its most concentrated form. The shells that landed after 3:51 had been, in a sense, aimed long before the guns fired. There is one detail buried inside those 35 minutes that almost never makes it into the story, and it matters more than people realize. Of the 6 American battleships in that line, only 3 carried the newest fire control radar, the kind capable of accurate, blind shooting at long range in total darkness against a target no human eye could find. The other 3 carried older equipment, and when the moment came, they would contribute almost nothing to the shooting at all. The battle line looked overwhelming on paper. 6 battleships, a wall of cruisers. In practice, its entire striking power that night rested on 3 ships. Then at 3:51 in the morning, the guns spoke. West Virginia's opening salvo struck the Yamashiro squarely. Within moments, the other radar-equipped battleships joined in, and the cruiser line opened up along both flanks, and the entire northern end of the strait lit up at once. What the Japanese experienced in those minutes is close to unimaginable. They were steaming up a narrow channel in absolute darkness, already torn apart by a torpedo attack from an enemy they could barely see, and now heavy shells began arriving out of nothing. No muzzle flashes to aim back at, not at first, because the range was still too great, and the American ships remained hull down in the darkness. The Yamashiro was being struck again and again by fire that seemed to come from nowhere at all, delivered with an accuracy no Japanese gunner alive could have matched in those conditions. She fought back. That deserves to be said plainly, because it took a particular kind of courage. The Yamashiro trained her forward turrets on the gun flashes as they finally became visible, and she returned fire. She kept steaming north. She kept firing, even as she was pounded from ahead and from both flanks at once. The cruiser Mogami fired too. So did the destroyer Shiga. 3 ships against 6 battleships and a full line of cruisers, and the destroyers still working the edges of the fight. And this is where the mismatch becomes clearest. Courage could still determine how men behaved inside the ship. It could keep gun crews at their stations, damage control parties moving through smoke and flooding compartments, and an admiral advancing after the plan around him had collapsed. But courage could not change the firing geometry. Yamashiro was at the head of a broken column inside a narrow channel, trying to answer fire from a line that could bring far more guns to bear. Every minute she remained on that course, the American ships had the easier problem. Nishimura had to identify flashes through darkness and smoke, determine which ship was firing, range it, and return accurate fire while his own flagship was already damaged. The men aboard Yamashiro could perform bravely and still have almost no path to a different result. That is one of the hardest truths in military history. Individual courage matters enormously to the people inside a battle. It does not always matter to the outcome of the battle itself. For the next 18 minutes, the American battle line and its cruisers poured several hundred large-caliber shells into the head of that Japanese column. West Virginia alone fired 93 rounds from her 16-inch guns. The Yamashiro was hit again and again. Her upper works wrecked, fires spreading through her hull. At 11 minutes past 4, with his own destroyers still working near the target and reports of friendly ships being straddled by American fire, Oldendorf gave the order to cease fire. By that point, the contribution of the battle line has to be kept in proportion because the American records make it clear enough. 3 of the 6 battleships did nearly all the shooting because only they had the radar to do it. The Mississippi, one of the ships with older equipment, fired a single full salvo late in the action. That salvo carries a strange distinction in the history of naval warfare. It is generally reckoned to be the last one ever fired by a battleship at another battleship anywhere in the history of the world. It was aimed at a ship that was already dying. The Yamashiro turned to withdraw torn open by torpedoes and shells, and she did not get far. She capsized and went down at 19 minutes past 4 in the morning, taking Vice Admiral Nishimura Shoji with her. Of a crew of more than 1,500 men, only a handful survived. His body was never recovered. He remains, to this day, exactly where his flagship went down, in the middle of the strait he had been ordered to force. There is one detail about the man that appears often in serious histories, and it deserves to be handled with care rather than certainty. Nishimura's son, a young officer, had been killed earlier in the war. Many accounts suggest that loss left him fatalistic, indifferent to whether he survived what came next. It may well be true, but it is the kind of explanation offered for a man who left no written account of his own thinking and never came back to confirm or deny it. What Kitsold said with confidence is simpler and in its own way more devastating. He received an order to force a defended strait at night without air cover against a force he knew was waiting for him. He did not argue. He did not delay. He did not seek out the second Japanese force nearby to coordinate an approach that might have given him a chance. He signaled his position and his intentions to his superiors. He formed his ships into battle order, and he went in at 20 knots. Whatever was in his mind that night, he carried out the mission exactly as it was given to him, and it killed him, and it killed almost everyone standing beside him. The Mogami, burning and no longer under full control, staggered south away from the wreckage of the fight. The destroyer Shiga, the only ship left in Nishimura's entire force still in fighting condition, turned as well and ran for the southern exit of the strait. She made it, alone, out of 7 warships that had entered that channel. The Shiga came through the night intact. She carries a strange reputation in Japanese naval history. Because of it, a ship that seemed to survive battles that destroyed everything around her, again and again, across the war. This would not be the last time. And then, at 25 minutes past 4, the second Japanese force finally arrived. Vice Admiral Shima Kiyohide came up the strait with his cruisers, entirely unaware of the details of what had just happened ahead of him. There had never been a working plan between the two commanders. There had never been useful communication, so Shima ran, in the darkness, straight into burning wreckage. He saw 2 large masses of fire on the water and took them to be both Japanese battleships, already lost. That single sight told him everything he believed he needed to know. His cruisers fired torpedoes at radar contacts in the dark, hit nothing, and turned to retire. In the confusion of that withdrawal, his own flagship, the heavy cruiser Nachi, collided with the crippled Mogami, which was still moving, and which the Nachi's crew had apparently assumed was already dead in the water. Both ships were damaged in the collision. The Mogami, already wrecked from the battle, was attacked from the air later that same morning and finally scuttled. Shima withdrew with what he had left. Total up what that single night cost. Nishimura took 7 warships into the Surigao Strait. He lost both battleships, 3 destroyers, eventually the heavy cruiser as well. 1 destroyer escaped. The second Japanese force accomplished nothing at all, collided with its own side in the dark, and retreated without firing a shot that mattered. Something over 4,000 Japanese sailors died in that channel in a single night. American losses were 1 patrol torpedo boat, 1 destroyer damaged by friendly fire, around 40 men killed. Sit with that ratio for a moment, because it is not the sort of number that happens between two competent, evenly matched forces. Roughly, 100 men lost for every 1,000 of the enemy is not a battle result in any ordinary sense. It is what happens when one side has arranged the entire encounter in advance, down to the smallest detail, and the other side walks into it, under orders, with its eyes open. From the Yamashiro's crew of more than 1,500 men, only about 10 survived. From the Fuso, almost nobody. American ships in the area pulled some Japanese sailors out of the water in the hours after the battle. A number of others reportedly refused rescue when it was offered, whether from the belief that surrender was dishonorable or from something closer to simple despair. No one who lived through that morning could say for certain. Many of those who did survive did so by swimming, alone in the dark, to the shores of nearby islands and waiting to see what daylight would bring. The great majority of the men who entered that strait never left it. When American officers eventually asked a representative of the Japanese Navy to account for what had happened to Nishimura's entire squadron, the answer that came back from the one command still standing was almost unbearably short. There was nothing to report, because every ship in the formation except one had gone down. It is about as complete a summary of a naval disaster as anyone has ever produced. An entire force sent into a strait, and the only ship left to describe what happened had simply watched every other vessel in its formation die around it, one at a time, without being able to do anything about it at all. Now, look again at the 6 battleships that had just closed the northern end of that strait. Look at where every one of them had been on the morning of the 7th, 1941. The West Virginia, the ship that fired that first radar-directed salvo and hit with it, had been struck by torpedoes at Pearl Harbor and had settled onto the harbor floor. The California had been torpedoed and sunk at her moorings in the days that followed. The Tennessee had been bombed, pinned in place by the wreckage of the ships burning around her. The Maryland had been bombed as well. The Pennsylvania, Oldendorf's own flagship that night, had been sitting in dry dock when the attack came and had been hit there. Only the Mississippi, which had been in the Atlantic that morning, had escaped it entirely. 5 of the 6 ships that destroyed a Japanese battle line in the Surigao Strait had themselves been sunk or crippled by the Japanese Navy 3 years earlier. In the opening minutes of this same war, salvage crews had spent months afterward working in the oil and the mud of that harbor, pumping out flooded hulls, patching torpedo holes from the inside, refloating ships that any reasonable observer would have written off as total losses. Divers went down into compartments that had been sealed underwater for weeks, working by touch in complete darkness, recovering the men who had not made it out. Ships came up from the bottom of that harbor, one compartment at a time, were towed home, and were rebuilt in several cases more thoroughly than they had ever been modernized in peacetime. New anti-aircraft batteries, new fire control systems, and the radar that would matter so completely on this particular night, in this particular strait. There is no evidence that anyone planned this symmetry. The officers who built that ambush seemed to have been far too busy in the 36 hours they had to dwell on where their ships had come from. But a great many of the men standing at their stations that night had been at Pearl Harbor themselves 3 years earlier. They had pulled shipmates out of burning water. They had watched those same ships towed away for scrap. or so it seemed at the time, and they had spent 3 years waiting. And for the sailors who understood that history personally, the symmetry must have been difficult to ignore once the firing stopped. At Pearl Harbor, the initiative had belonged entirely to Japan. American battleships had been caught at anchor, compressed into a harbor, unable to maneuver, many crews not yet at battle stations when the attack began. Japan had chosen the time, the direction, and the terms of contact. At Surigao, almost every part of that relationship had reversed. Now, it was the Japanese battle line entering confined water. Now the Americans had chosen the ground. Now, American crews were waiting before the enemy arrived. The first decisive information came from American radar, the first crippling blows from American torpedoes, and the final heavy gun from ships positioned exactly where their commander wanted them. It was not revenge in any operational sense. Oldendorf's plan was built because it was tactically correct, not because it was poetic. But history does not need anyone to arrange a symbol for the symbol to exist. The battleships raised from Pearl Harbor had returned transformed. Their hulls had been repaired, their weapons modernized, their sensors improved, and the Navy around them had changed even more. The institution, surprised in 1941, had spent 3 years learning how not to be surprised again. Surigao Strait was what that learning looked like when compressed into one night. Reconnaissance, layered defense, radar, controlled fire, destroyer aggression, and a commander willing to wait until every advantage was aligned before he used it. Almost 3 years to the day after the attack that started this war. The ships Japan had tried to destroy in its opening minutes were sitting in the dark at the far end of a narrow channel, waiting for a Japanese battle line to come to them. There is one more piece of this night that most tellings of the story leave out entirely, and it changes the shape of everything that came before it. While Oldendorf was destroying Nishimura's force in the south, a disaster was taking shape 150 miles to the north. The strongest of Japan's 3 forces under Shugo, commanded by Vice Admiral Kurita, had come through the San Bernardino Strait completely unopposed because the American fast carrier fleet had been drawn north, chasing the empty Japanese decoy carriers exactly as the plan intended. At dawn on that same morning, Kurita's battleships and cruisers fell on a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers off the island of Samar. The calls for help went out across the entire area. They reached Oldendorf, and he could not come. He was at the wrong end of the operation, more than 100 miles away, with battleships that had just fought a night action and burned through a great deal of the armor-piercing ammunition he'd been so careful about rationing. Only hours earlier, he gathered what he could and turned north, and it was never going to be in time. The desperate stand of a handful of destroyers and escort carriers off Samar, one of the most extraordinary actions in the history of the United States Navy, happened in part because the only heavy American surface force in the area had spent that same night winning a perfect, complete victory in the wrong strait, 150 miles away. There is no blame to assign for that, and it matters to say so plainly. Oldendorf had been given a mission, and he had executed it about as well as any admiral has ever executed anything in the history of naval warfare. He could not be in 2 places at once, and the Japanese plan had been built deliberately. to guarantee that he would not be. Sending Nishimura's force through the southern strait had always been partly a diversion, meant to pull the American battleships south, away from where the real blow was coming. And in the narrowest possible sense, that part of the plan actually worked. Nishimura's squadron was annihilated, and it still accomplished exactly what it was meant to accomplish. It kept Oldendorf's battleships out of the fight that mattered most that morning. Then Japan threw the opportunity away anyway. Kurita, battered and confused by the very escort ships he was slaughtering off Samar, turned his fleet around. Before reaching the invasion beaches he had broken through to destroy. Both halves of the Japanese plan were paid for in full. Neither one achieved anything at all. No battleship has fired its main guns at another battleship since that night anywhere in the world. No navy has crossed an enemy's line in a fleet action since. For 20 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained for exactly one thing above everything else: the decisive battle line engagement, where superior seamanship and superior nerve would settle a war in a single night. On that October morning, in a narrow Philippine strait, they finally got it. They got the exact battle they had built their entire doctrine around. And they got it on the wrong side of the formation, in a channel with no way out, against ships they had already sunk once before. The battle they had trained for a generation, lasted 18 minutes. There is a second reversal folded inside that first one, and it belongs to the smaller ships. Everyone remembers Surigao as the last clash of the great battleships, and in a technical sense, that is exactly what it was. But the battleships did not destroy Nishimura's force. Destroyers did that, with torpedoes, in the dark, before the heavy guns had fired a single round. The 18 minutes of gunnery that followed were less a battle than a formality. The age of the battleship ended in a night action where the decisive weapon was fired from a ship fraction of the size of the ones that would take the credit for it. The Shiga, the one ship that made it out of that strait alive, did not survive much longer. She was torpedoed and sunk by an American submarine in the Gulf of Siam roughly 3 months later, closing the account on Nishimura's squadron completely. Vice Admiral Shima survived the war. He had sailed into an unwinnable situation, seen an entire Japanese formation burning on the water ahead of him, and chosen to withdraw rather than add his own ships to the wreckage. History has been reasonably fair to that judgment, even though it ended his career. The American battleships that fought that night had short futures of their own, in the way that all battleships did after 1945. Several of them fired their guns again in support of the landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa in the months that followed, doing the shore bombardment work that had by then become the real job of a battleship. Then the war ended, and within a few years, most of them were sold for scrap or expended as targets in weapons tests. A few were used at the atomic tests at Bikini Atoll, which is as a strange, almost unbearable fate for ships that had survived Pearl Harbor and come back to win the last gun battle of their age. One of them escaped that ending. The West Virginia, the ship that opened the shooting and hit with her very first salvo, was eventually broken up as well, but pieces of her were preserved. Part of her mast still stands today on a university campus in the state she was named for. The sailors who served aboard the ships raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, spent the rest of their lives being asked about the morning the war began. Rather fewer of them were ever asked about the night. 3 years later, when they helped finish a Japanese battle line in a dark channel in the Philippines, which is a pity, because they were there for both. That is what Surigao Strait actually was. 18 minutes. That is how long it took for the last battle line the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever send anywhere to be erased from the water. Not by luck, not by chance, by 36 hours of preparation, a channel with no way out, and ships that had already been sunk once before coming back to finish the job the war had started with them.